Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. Today we conclude the 5th week of our course by looking at guerrilla warfare in the state. Such irregular violence was probably the most widely noted and most notorious part of the Civil War in Missouri. It was part and parcel of the disorder that gripped much of the state, and it became the most intractable problem faced by Union forces. We'll begin today by considering the military's declaration of martial law and its effects within the state. In short, martial law failed to quell the irregular violence. The Union Army tried to engage and defeat pro-Confederate guerrillas in combat, yet those efforts too were largely unsuccessful. Ultimately, Federal troops declared war of no quarter against these so-called bushwhackers. The guerrillas called this war under the black flag, and it would scorch much of Missouri. The Union military established martial law at an early point, in August 1861. And although various commanders would modify the terms, it would remain in effect through the end of the Civil War. Martial law shaped Missourians' lives in ways both large and small. Union authorities suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which required that criminal suspects be informed of the charges brought against them. The kinds of liberties and due process protections that citizens could expect during peacetime often seemed to disappear. We've talked earlier about the kinds of economic penalties that came with the imposition of martial law. These included assessments and bonds. In addition, the Army carefully monitored newspapers for traces of secessionist sympathy. It regulated trade, including the sale of firearms and their use too. It helped shape the kinds and the hours of amusements that civilians and soldiers might enjoy. The sale of alcohol, for example, was prohibited after noon on Sundays. People's movements were watched. Moving from one part of the state to another required a pass from the Army. Provost marshals and their deputies enforced many of these restrictions. Flaws within that system quickly became evident. Provost marshals exercised considerable independence, and such latitude resulted in widespread abuses of power. That many of the officials were local residents who hired their own staffs only sharpened the problems. Missouri was hardly the only state to suffer under years of martial law, but it was the state most ravaged by guerrilla violence, and thus was the place where martial law came to be applied with the most force. As I've noted before, one of the Union's top priorities was maintaining control of the rivers and the railroads and the telegraph lines in this state. Guerrilla fighters posed the gravest danger to all of them. Their ability to strike and then to vanish quickly as they burned bridges, cut wires, attacked travelers, this made virtually any target vulnerable. The Army thus made such crimes capital offenses. The provisional government under Hamilton Gamble, or the civil authorities in Missouri's many counties, they could hardly hope to pacify this guerrilla threat. Missouri was a large state, and outside of St. Louis, its mostly rural population was widely dispersed. Only the Union Army, together with its network of provost marshals and loyal home guard units, possessed the manpower and the resources to coordinate a policy that might halt this threat over such a broad area. Yet, as we'll see over the next few lectures, the military struggled not just to halt or even to limit guerrilla violence, but to engage the guerrillas at all. Guerrilla fighters enjoyed several advantages over conventional or regular troops. First, guerrillas moved upon horseback and in small numbers, usually with no more than a few dozen per band. Their mobility allowed them to strike and then withdraw with great stealth. At times, the guerrillas were everywhere. At other times, they were nowhere. Familiarity with the surrounding countryside aided their concealment. Hiding in the brushy woods along Missouri streams and rivers, the pro-Confederate guerrillas became known as bushwhackers. This was originally a term of derision. It wasn't something you wanted to be called, but these guerrillas came to embrace the term and to appropriate it for themselves. The support that guerrillas received from local households, which is a subject we'll take up in the next video, this was another critical advantage. In the event that irregular fighters were intercepted by Union cavalry or foot soldiers, The pistols that the guerrillas preferred could be refired more quickly than the rifles commonly carried by federal troops. The guerrillas' Unionist foes decried their lawlessness and their savagery. Bushwhackers, they contended, preyed upon civilians, robbing, burning, and killing as they roamed. They tortured and killed prisoners, and it seemed to their victims that they exhibited an almost wanton bloodlust. Pro-Confederate guerrillas in central Missouri did dangle the scalps and severed body parts of their victims from horses' bridles as a kind of gruesome trophy. Francis Lieber, the Northern scholar who helped to craft the rules of war for the U.S. Army, saw important distinctions between soldiers who were entitled to all the protections of the laws of war and guerrillas who were not. Union officers looked to Lieber's writings and found sanction for the summary execution of guerrillas they captured. Flouting the conventions of honorable combat, guerrillas seemingly did not deserve humane treatment. And I should be clear that I'm talking mostly here about pro-Confederate guerrillas. Most of the Unionists who took up arms in Missouri did so within the regular army or within local Unionist militia. Of the irregular fighters who did sympathize with the Union, the greatest number seemed to come from Kansas, the so-called Jayhawkers or Redlegs, known for the stripes on their pants. Many of them were veterans of the Border War that had raged for years, and with the start of the National Civil War, a lot of these people floated in and out of regular troop units. Several of the pro-Confederate guerrillas in Missouri identified themselves as partisan rangers. One example was Colonel Joseph Porter, who rode across Missouri in the summer of 1862 to recruit men and to harass federal troops. In October 1862, Porter's raiders seized a Union man, Andrew Alsman, from the town of Palmyra. A local Union commander announced that if Alsman did not reappear within 10 days, 10 Confederate prisoners, chosen at random, would be shot in retaliation. The time soon passed, and no sign of Alsman. And on October 18th, Union troops followed through with the announced executions. Most of these captives were captured local guerrillas, and each faced the firing squad standing at the foot of his own coffin. Porter survived this so-called Palmyra massacre, but 3 months later, he too would perish in a fight in Wright County. Perhaps the most famous, or notorious, depending upon one's point of view, guerrilla in Missouri was William Clark Quantrill. He claimed to have sought and obtained a commission from the Confederate government as a partisan ranger under an 1862 bill. Some contemporaries questioned the veracity of Quantrill's claim, and even Confederate leaders, including Jeff Davis and Robert E. Lee, seemed ambivalent about the guerrillas. Daniel Sutherland has described this in his masterful book, A Savage War. On one hand, rebel leaders thought that such vicious tactics were beneath the dignity of honorable troops. But on the other hand, they appreciated the effectiveness of these fighters, who functioned as detached cavalry and tied down a much larger force that could otherwise be used to fight in the East. A web of factors, ideological, economic, personal, motivated these guerrillas to fight. Many, including Porter and Frank James, fought in the Missouri State Guard. But once the Union victory at Pea Ridge had effectively dashed rebel hopes for taking Missouri back, a growing number of guardsmen returned home to fight in the brush. Support for the Confederacy and its principles continued to inspire many of these men. But it was clear that politics alone did not drive most guerrillas. Mark Geiger, whose work on conspiracy we've already discussed, contends that financial concerns were a critical issue. The most intense guerrilla fighting, he finds, happened in the counties where the bonded debt was the greatest. Years ago, another historian named Don Bowen found that guerrillas were more likely to come from Southern families of wealth, suggesting that this struggle was an effort by slaveholders' sons to protect wealth and status. Perhaps even more powerful was the sense among many men that they were fighting to defend their families, their homes, and their communities You may recall the part from Ken Burns' famous documentary about the Civil War, in which writer Shelby Foote tells the story of a Union soldier who asks a rebel, "Why are you people fighting?" And the Confederate replies back, "Because you're here." And that story may be apocryphal, but I think it belies the complex mix of factors that motivate people to fight, but there's something to it, and you see this in the recollections of many of the guerrillas. Many Missourians looked upon the federal troops within their state as a hostile, even menacing, occupying force. Never mind the fact that many of their own neighbors were Unionists. For Southern sympathizers, the guerrilla war becomes their best hope for repelling the Federals from their midst. Beneath these reasons, there were often deep, sometimes visceral desires for vengeance. The Civil War broke open years of personal and political hatred. They'd simmered just below the surface. On the Kansas border especially, years of partisan animosity broke forth in this endless cycle of tit-for-tat retaliatory violence. And it wasn't just Missourians fighting Kansans, though. It was Missourians fighting each other. When a Unionist militia stopped and killed Cass County merchant Henry Younger, who had been an avowed Unionist man, the victim's teenage son Coleman, the seventh of 14 children, resolved to take to the brush and avenge his father's death. Union leaders sensed the personal nature of this fighting. John Schofield wrote that in Missouri, the war was, quote, the result of old feuds and involves very little, if at all, the question of union or disunion, end quote. Said one Missourian, the cry of disloyal could very easily be raised against any man who happened to have a superabundance of property. To be sure, as society collapsed in profound ways, some of the guerrillas were little better than ordinary criminals who seized upon the disorder for bloodthirsty adventure or personal gain. The American Civil War gets described often as a brother's war or a neighbor's war. In Missouri, you can see this intimate and local nature of warfare. Victims and perpetrators, these were usually people who knew one another, and that intimacy makes the violence all the worse. 25 years ago, the late historian Michael Fellman wrote what I think is still the foremost book on Missouri's guerrilla war. It's called Inside War. And in Fellman's estimation, Missouri was home to the war of 10,000 nasty incidents. Fellman argues that by 1865, the war that raged in Missouri's countryside had devolved into nihilistic mayhem. In large parts of Missouri, where organized rebel militia were long gone, this guerrilla insurgency became the war, the effort to dislodge the U.S. Army. That the insurgency burned so hot for so many years tells us something about the fraying social fabric of this border state. Next week, we return to the guerrilla war and to its social foundations. We begin by looking at the role of women in what some historians have called the household war. Women were active parts of this guerrilla war. They sustained them, and they presented a difficult challenge for the troops that tried to subdue the guerrillas. Until then.